You have to remember that John Kennedy, more than anyone else in Congress, I would argue, supported America coming to the defense of South Vietnam.
We are assisting in every way we properly can. The people of South Vietnam, who with the greatest courage are attempting to maintain their freedom.
As the stakes grow higher in Vietnam, a violent coup leads to the murder of South Vietnam's leader.
The consequence of the overthrow of Nhu Diem was enormous instability in South Vietnam, that it was something that the North Vietnamese viewed as an incredible blessing.
In America, a president is assassinated, raising questions about what might happen next in Southeast Asia.
I mean, there's really no evidence that John Kennedy was a sort of closet dove. But of course, we don't know because he was killed shortly after that.
Welcome back. In 1960, American voters elected a new president and a new administration with a different outlook on U.S. foreign policy. In his inaugural address, John F. Kennedy famously promised that America would pay any price and bear any burden to assure the survival and success of liberty. Over the course of his presidency, Kennedy's commitment to that vow would be tested in Europe, in Latin America, and in Southeast Asia. Just 1 year into his administration, Kennedy addressed the people of Vietnam directly. For the young president, Vietnam was a test of American resolve in the battle against global communism. It was a fight he did not want to lose.
On the occasion of your New Year's celebration, my fellow Americans and I extend our very best wishes for the prosperity and well-being of the government and the people of Vietnam.
Kennedy inherited a war already well underway. In violation of the 1954 Geneva Accords, the North Vietnamese had begun actively supporting an irregular army in the south, transporting men, weapons, and ammunition over the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a complex web of roads almost 10,000 miles in length, built through neighboring Laos and Cambodia. The trail would prove critical to the North's efforts throughout the war, but because it traversed supposedly neutral countries, the U.S. never put its full effort into shutting it down.
In May of 1959, they opened the Ho Chi Minh Trail. During the, let's say, core guerrilla period of the war, the North Vietnamese were running about 300,000 fighters in South Vietnam. If you cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the war is utterly different. So one of the great mistakes made in the war was the failure to cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail.
When President Kennedy took office, there were roughly 900 American military advisors in Vietnam. 5 were killed over the course of 1960. By the end of 1961, Kennedy had increased the U.S. presence to 3,200 and dispatched helicopters and crews to fly combat missions against the growing irregular presence in the South. Kennedy doubled funding for the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, or ARVN, South Vietnam's military forces. And to deprive guerrillas of cover and food, he authorized the use of powerful herbicides, chiefly the new chemical Agent Orange, so named because of the orange identifying stripe on the 55-gallon drums in which it was stored. Like Eisenhower before him, Kennedy did not want to send regular ground troops to Vietnam. But in contrast to his predecessor, he viewed Vietnam as a new type of conflict that would require a different and more flexible military response.
The doctrine in the Eisenhower administration of kind of massive retaliation was seen as not credible, and in part because of these communist insurgencies that were taking place around the world and other types of insurgencies. With the Kennedy administration, with the flexible response doctrine, they wanted to look at more credible deterrence of force at different levels of conflict. So at the top end, you have strategic nuclear forces, and that deters there. At the middle ground, you have conventional forces, like in NATO and in Western Europe. And so we built up our conventional forces to stop, Warsaw Pact invasion. And then at the lowest level, unconventional warfare, we started to develop the techniques and the forces needed to fight counterinsurgency warfare, whether it was air mobile operations, which were then being developed, things like special operations forces and so forth.
To be a member of the class of 1962 at West Point was to stand at a new threshold in military history, facing an unparalleled challenge.
Kennedy described to the cadets the new kind of conflict he believed they would face.
This is another type of warfare, new in its intensity, ancient in its origin, war by guerrillas, subversives, insurgents, assassins, war by ambush instead of by combat. It is a form of warfare uniquely adapted to what has been strangely called wars of liberation. It requires, if freedom is to be saved, a whole new kind of strategy, a wholly different kind of force, and therefore a new and wholly different kind of military training.
Vietnam was supposed to be a test case of this new military strategy that the Kennedy administration was pursuing, the so-called flexible response doctrine, where instead of responding with nuclear weapons to everything, as the Eisenhower administration said, we're going to respond flexibly. If there's a guerrilla war, well, we're going to send in the Green Berets. I mean, his brother Robert Kennedy was responsible for founding the Green Berets.
President Kennedy loved Army Special Forces and the Navy SEALs. They were his baby. We had special operations people in World War II and even before, but he modernized them. I knew a number of those guys, and in the second part of my experience in Vietnam, I did some of that work. And I can tell you that it was more like being in the Peace Corps with guns.
Like the Peace Corps, the American Special Forces worked closely with the local population, trying to win their hearts and minds, village by village. The South Vietnamese were trained to defend themselves in hopes that they would align themselves with the Saigon government and turn against the communist revolutionaries known as the Viet Cong.
The use of military personnel to win friends as well as to fight is gaining ground in Vietnam. A villager is likely to be more interested in a new roof for his house than in the outcome of the Cold War or the threat of communism.
It was called the Strategic Hamlet Program, a massive relocation effort that affected the lives of more than 4 million South Vietnamese, fully 1/3 of the population. The American press quickly deemed it a failure.
One of the least well understood aspects of the Vietnam War was the Strategic Hamlet Program. The key to the program was really human, and what they decided to do was to create militias in the hamlets that would be there 24/7 so the communists couldn't come and go at night as they often did. This was often maligned in the Western press and afterwards, but we now know, especially from communist sources that we've been able to obtain, that in fact this program was highly effective. The communists recognized it as a serious threat because it was cutting off their access to the population who they needed to get recruits, to get rice, to get information.
Also key to Kennedy's plan for Vietnam was a new approach to warfighting, based not on classical military strategy, but on management techniques employed by America's largest and most successful corporations. Statistical analysis was at the heart of a novel way of understanding every human endeavor, and its most enthusiastic adherents believed war would be no exception. Guiding the new president's thinking was an intense executive and academic who had transformed the Ford Motor Company.
I'm Bob McNamara, Group Vice President in charge of the car and truck divisions of the company.
As Secretary of Defense, Robert Strange McNamara was at the heart of Kennedy's foreign policy team. Drawn from universities and the corporate world, they would be called at various times the whiz kids, the best and the brightest, and the Imperial Brotherhood.
He was a very bright man. He was an educated man, but he was not a military man. He did not understand military culture. He did not understand military tactics, and he thought he was superior to the country's top military advisors and thus ignored them.
He was seen as a highly effective corporate executive and manager, and somebody who could help tame the sluggish Pentagon bureaucracy. And for much of the early period of American troop involvement, he is the principal decision maker. And on a lot of controversies, we now know that McNamara was in fact wrong, but he stifled a lot of dissent. He also ignored intelligence, and when intelligence didn't meet his preconceived point of view, he would get somebody else to produce an assessment that would support his view.
From the beginning, there were some who doubted that even the most sophisticated models could predict how a war would unfold.
McNamara developed this kind of quantitative view of things, of how you could reduce war to a game of numbers almost. The right troop balances with the right number of bombs dropped and other metrics that you could somehow come up with a formula that would win a war.
Kennedy and his team were quickly confronted by America's Cold War adversaries. Within a month of taking office, the new president greenlit the invasion of Cuba's southern coast by U.S.-backed Cuban exiles. The landing at the Bay of Pigs ended in failure and humiliation for the administration and was interpreted as weakness in the Kremlin and Beijing. In the summer of 1961, Kennedy acquiesced to the construction of the Berlin Wall, built to stop a phenomenon that occurred everywhere the communists took over, the mass flight of people desperate to escape Marxist rule.
Ich bin ein Berliner.
And then there was the Cuban Missile Crisis.
This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba.
The world's future seemed to balance on a knife's edge until the Soviets withdrew. It was perhaps the ultimate test of the young president's ability to handle foreign crises. Russia pulled its missiles from Cuba, but obtained major concessions from Kennedy, who secretly agreed to remove U.S. missiles from Turkey.
Well, Khrushchev was a formidable contender to Kennedy. He was very activist and wanting to promote the communist vision around the world, and was more than willing to do provocative things. So he and Kennedy had this kind of contentious relationship. And Vietnam was just another battlefront, like the Berlin Wall, like the Cuban Missile Crisis, and other things that took place in those early years.
By the end of 1962, U.S. military personnel in Vietnam numbered more than 11,000, and the annual American death toll climbed to 53. As Kennedy increased America's commitment to the South Vietnamese government in Saigon, China stepped up its support for the North Vietnamese leaders in Hanoi, equipping 230 new battalions. The Soviets continued to pour in weapons and supplies, helping Hanoi create what was becoming a fully equipped, conventional military force.
It, certainly wasn't just peasants rising up with pitchforks and rakes and things like that and primitive instruments. Right from the beginning, billions of dollars worth of weapons, were sent over by both the Soviets and the Chinese. They wouldn't have been able to fight the war without that help.
The Soviet Union and China basically kept North Vietnam going, not just with military supplies, ammunition tanks, aircraft, anti-aircraft, what have you, but also food, energy, anything that they needed, they were keeping it afloat.
South Vietnam, focal point of the West's fight against communism in Southeast Asia. For nearly a decade, Premier Ngo Dinh Diem ruled his small nation of 15 million without open opposition.
President Ngo Dinh Diem had ruled in the South since the country's division in 1954. A staunch anti-communist and ardent Catholic, Lyndon Johnson would later observe, "He was a bastard, but he's our bastard."
Most historians have misunderstood Diem in the same way that a lot of the Americans at the time did. They believed he was too authoritarian, that he was not accommodating enough to oppositionists. If you look at other allies in the region, in South Korea or Taiwan or Malaysia or Singapore, those countries were also authoritarian. It takes at least a generation to transition towards a more representative form of government, and it was unrealistic, I think, to expect Diem to become a George Washington at a time of civil war. And if you look within even our own civil war in the United States, a lot of civil liberties go out the window because you're dealing with armed subversion.
President Diem was not a puppet and refused to be a puppet of the United States. He was a traditional Vietnamese Mandarin, and the traditions that he abided by were not the same as the American idea of democracy and freedom.
Diem had worked under the French briefly when they promised him more control, and when they denied that, he resigned and returned all of the honors they'd given him and so forth. And then he became the most competent and most courageous and most uncorrupt nationalist in South Vietnam.
The South Vietnamese economy flourished, fueled in part by U.S. aid and military spending. Meanwhile, North Vietnamese efforts to disrupt the South continued as men, supplies, and armaments flowed down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. In May 1962, Robert McNamara visited South Vietnam for the first time and told the press, "Every quantitative measurement shows that we are winning the war." Presidential advisor John P. Roche summed up the views of those who doubted that statistical analysis could quantify something as complicated as the escalating conflict in Vietnam.
John Roche said Robert McNamara didn't know the difference between a war and a war game. And he also saw McNamara taking, figures out of thin air, just like essentially making it up. He called it a simulated exactitude.
The North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong were not the only problems facing Diem's regime. By the summer of 1963, South Vietnamese Buddhists, a majority of the population, were mounting mass protests against Diem.
Students and Buddhists rose against oppressive measures by the Roman Catholic Diem family.
On May 8th, South Vietnamese soldiers opened fire on a crowd in the city of Hue, killing 9 unarmed protesters. Rallies and marches spread throughout the country. And on June 11th, a Buddhist monk, having notified the press, set fire to himself in central Saigon, bringing international attention to the crisis. The news and graphic photos stunned Americans. Diem offered concessions, but it wasn't enough to satisfy Washington.
Many American diplomats were used to third world leaders basically doing what they were told by the American Pro-Council. Diem said, "I am the president of this country. I will do what I think is right for my country. I welcome your financial assistance. I welcome your advice, but I will make the decisions." And that just annoyed some American diplomats who thought he was being uppity and didn't understand his role in the world.
And the demonstrators clashed with the police again and again during the week-long series of incidents like this.
As protests mounted against Diem, elements within the South Vietnamese military began plotting his removal. The CIA and the U.S. Embassy encouraged the coup. Ambassador Henry Lodge cabled Washington, saying, "We are now launched on a course from which there is no respectable turning back, the overthrow of the Diem government." Kennedy was at first reluctant to support the overthrow of an American ally, but by summer's end, he was sending clear signals to Saigon: change policies or face the consequences. With the U.S. on track to lose another 122 soldiers in Vietnam that year, the president, vacationing in Hyannisport, sat down with Walter Cronkite of CBS News.
Mr. President, the only hot war we've got running at the moment is, of course, the one in Vietnam. and we've got our difficulties there, quite obviously.
Well, in the first place, we ought to realize that Vietnam has been at war for 25 years. Well, the war is still going. In many ways, it's going better. That doesn't mean, however, that the events of the last 2 months aren't very ominous. I don't think that unless a greater effort is made by the government to win popular support, that the war can be won out there. In the final analysis, it's their war. They're the ones who have to win it or lose it. The repressions against the Buddhists, we felt, were very unwise. Now, all we can do is to make it very clear that we don't think this is the way to win. It's my hope that this will become increasingly obvious to the government, that they will take steps to try to bring back popular support for this very essential struggle.
Do you think that this government still has time to regain the support of the people?
With changes in policy and perhaps in personnel, I think it can. If it doesn't make those changes, I would think that the chances of winning it would not be very good.
The regime of South Vietnam's president, Ngo Dinh Diem, comes to an end in a wave of violence.
Just after noon on November 1st, the South Vietnamese generals launched their coup. Diem called American Ambassador Henry Cabot Lodge. Lodge pretended ignorance. Diem and his brother were soon arrested and brutally murdered in the back of an armored car on November 2nd.
The United States at the time tried to sort of conceal its involvement, but we now know with excruciating detail how Ambassador Henry Cabot Lodge pushed for this coup, believing it was going to make things better. But the war was actually going pretty well up until his death. We see a total collapse of the government after his death, which will then necessitate American forces coming in. Had Diem not been assassinated with our support, I'm not sure we ever have seen American troops going to Vietnam, certainly not in the sorts of numbers that came afterwards.
It was a huge mistake to overthrow Ngo Dinh Diem. And indeed, the Military Assistance Advisory Group at the time described it as absolutely crazy as an idea. This was undertaken by a small group in the Department of State, and it was one of the 5 or 6 major mistakes in the overall warfighting of the Vietnam War.
On November 4th, Kennedy recorded his private feelings about the coup into his audio diary.
I feel that we must bear a good deal of responsibility for it, beginning with our cable of early August, in which we suggested the coup. I was shocked by the death of Diem and Ngo. The way he was killed made it particularly abhorrent. The question now is whether the generals will stay together and build a stable government, or whether Saigon will turn on public opinion in Saigon, intellectuals, students, etc. will turn on this government as repressive and undemocratic in the not too distant future.
Kennedy could have stopped the coup. He could have just said, we're not going to support this. We support Diem. Don't do this. It could have been stopped. He chose not to. He chose to listen to those who said Diem was a problem, and he could have stopped it. He chose not to. The U.S. government was completely complicit in this coup.
The murder of Diem was a turning point. Those within the American government who had pushed for the coup now felt responsible for what would happen next.
It was a case of, as Colin Powell said, you break it, you bought it. And after the coup, when this junta was elevated that we supported, then we had a moral obligation to defend Vietnam.
For the North, it presented further evidence that Saigon could be toppled and the country reunited under communist rule.
I actually had an interesting conversation with a man named Bui Cong Tung, who in my view was probably the most important defector from the Viet Cong in the entire war. He had been chief of education, culture, propaganda, and training, and I asked him, what did you think of Ngo Dinh Diem? And he paused and he said, we used our propaganda to turn the people against him, denounce him as an American puppet, and so forth. But in fact, He was a great patriot, and we had great respect for him. And he said, when we heard Diem had been killed, we thought it must be some kind of a trick, because surely the Americans could not be so foolish as to allow anything to happen to Diem.
Kennedy had increased the number of Americans in Vietnam to 16,000, some of whom were now engaged directly in clandestine military operations. With the presidential election just 1 year away, he faced a critical choice, whether to deepen his commitment in Vietnam or put in motion a plan to withdraw.
Several thousand enthusiastic Texans are on hand to give the President and Mrs. Kennedy a warm welcome.
Kennedy's comments, delivered at a Fort Worth breakfast on the morning of November 22, 1963, provide some insight into his thinking at the time.
This is a very dangerous and uncertain world. We would like to live as we once lived, but history will not permit it. The balance of power is still on the side of freedom. We are still the keystone and the arch of freedom, and I think we will continue to do as we have done in our past, our duty, a determination to not only maintain the peace, but also the vital interests of the United States.
The president's entourage left Fort Worth and traveled by Air Force One to Dallas. There, on the way to his next engagement, President Kennedy was cut down by an assassin's bullet.
A nation mourns, the world grieves. The man who became 35th president less than 3 years ago is dead.
Today, scholars still argue over which path Kennedy would have followed in Vietnam.
The aides who loved and worshiped the man saw he was going to be damaged by the image of the Vietnam War and said that he had decided to pull out of Vietnam after the election.
The text of the speech he was to deliver later that fateful day in Dallas provides additional insight. The staunchly anti-communist Kennedy planned to say, "Our security and strength in the last analysis directly depend on the security and strength of others. Our assistance to these nations can be painful, risky, and costly, as is true in Southeast Asia today. But we dare not weary of the task."
It is pure mythology to say that Kennedy was seriously thinking about getting out. At the time, Kennedy was a staunch Cold Warrior, and he had failed in 2 other areas, the Bay of Pigs and Laos, and made very clear that he couldn't afford another setback like this.
I think that John Kennedy was a man of principle and wanted us to support any friend, oppose any foe, as he said in his inaugural address. He really did believe that America was going to stand up to tyranny and so forth, and I respect him for his stand in Vietnam.
The murder of Ngo Dinh Diem in Vietnam and the assassination of President Kennedy in Dallas would have major consequences for the American war effort. As we'll see, a new president, Lyndon Baines Johnson, would soon face the same vexing choices as his predecessor: escalate American involvement, withdraw, or find some accommodation with Hanoi and its allies. That's next time as we continue our look at the unauthorized history of the Vietnam War.